Hello and welcome to this edition of the VIP show. In this episode, I will be interviewing a Labour MP who's been in Parliament for over 30 years and is a strong anti-war activist. The VIP is Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy is a member of the Stop the War coalition and has been active and vocal against Britain's wars in the Middle East and elsewhere. He's also a strong advocate of human rights.
I was born in a very small village in the west of England, in the county of Wiltshire, and people that come from Wiltshire are known as moonrakers, and that's the sort of colloquial name for people from that county. And my dad worked as an engineer, and my mum was a teacher. Grew up in that kind of environment, but also with an interest in the rest of the world, which was mainly inherited from my parents, who were very keen on understanding the world and reading books, and they gave me a lot of books, many of which I have here. They both had a very strong vision of a world of peace and of justice, and they imparted that to me, I suppose.
They were very political, and you grew up in a...
Well, they weren't mega active because I had three older brothers and they were both working, and we lived in quite a remote spot, so the opportunities for lots of political activity were fairly limited. And I became active in peace and human rights things when I was at school, through War on Want and through the campaign for nuclear disarmament. And then when I left school, I went to live in the Caribbean, in Jamaica, for 2 years as a volunteer. Doing teaching assistance, youth work. And then after that, I went on a tour on my own around Latin America.
Did you ever think of going into politics and becoming a politician when you were young?
No. I was active in the peace movement, development movement, and later joined the Labour Party. My mum and dad were both in the Labour Party. We became active in elections in the 1960s, and I was active in the Young Socialists. But I saw myself as being more like a political activist, and I was very active in the trade unions. And then I became more involved in local politics in North London. And the Islington North constituency MP had left the Labour Party and joined the Social Democrats, and they were looking for a new candidate, and some members of the party invited me to put my name in, and I did. After a very long process, was eventually very narrowly selected as the candidate, and I'm still here.
Well, yeah, you've been here now for 30 years as a Member of Parliament, and through your experiences as an MP at Westminster and here in Britain, what is it like?
The key thing about being a Member of Parliament in Britain is that you represent a constituency, a district, and I see my role as primarily a constituency representative, and so I spend a great deal of time dealing with individual people's problems, housing, immigration, asylum, social services, planning, all kinds of different issues that occur locally. It's also a very mixed community. There are people from all over the world who've made their homes in my constituency. Asylum seekers from many countries, from Vietnam, from Iran, from Iraq, from Chile in the 70s and 80s when Pinochet was in power, from Colombia, so many other countries, and more recently considerable numbers of people from the Congo and Somalia. And so you cannot represent an area like this without having a knowledge and awareness of the rest of the world. And I try to learn from the diaspora communities. And so on that basis, I've taken up a number of causes, for example, the problems of Kurdish people in Turkey and other countries, for example, the refugees that come from Africa. So that is, to me, a very important part of the job. The second part is that, and this isn't always understood, is there's a big confusion between Parliament and government in Britain. We don't have a written constitution. We have an unwritten constitution based essentially on every law that's been passed for the last 800 years, which is probably why we've got so many lawyers to interpret it. And our job as MPs is to hold the government to account. Now this becomes complicated when it's your party in government and there's great pressure not to disagree with your government, even if you think they're wrong. And because all ministers have to be members of Parliament, then there is a huge power of patronage of the party leaders and Prime Minister to decide who shall get what position and who shall be important in the future. I think that Parliament itself is very important, and I see my role as primarily a representative of my community, somebody who has the ability to speak and opportunity to speak in Parliament, which I consider to be a great privilege, and also the opportunity to espouse causes, and I'm particularly passionate on peace and human rights issues.
What would you say to sceptics who say, there's no point going into Parliament, you're not going to change much? The system's pretty much in control of most of the things, such as foreign policy and other domestic policy issues.
Well, you have to use whatever opportunities are available to you. You don't have to be starry-eyed about the ability to get up and make one speech in Parliament and the whole world changes. But it is possible to make considerable changes. It is possible to change and amend legislation. But above all, it's possible to be using the platform to speak up on issues of human rights abuse anywhere in the world, and that does get some resonance, does get some coverage, and it means that other people then hear much more about it. And so I think you have to remember that you're there primarily because the people have put you there to represent them, and it's when you get a bit above yourself, as we say, that's when the problems start to happen.
You're a strong advocate for a united Ireland. Tell us why that's the case, and what's so special about Ireland?
Well, Ireland has a huge narrative through British history, and the relationship between Britain and Ireland has fundamentally been an abusive one. Take it back hundreds of years to the colonisation of Ireland, the division of Ireland and the treatment of Irish people. And going back to even the English Civil War, which at one level was a civil war of Parliament versus the Crown. Parliament won the war, sort of. Cromwell then became the leader of the country, and he called himself the Lord Protector. And then, despite all the democratic rhetoric of the English Civil War, then proceeded to go and colonise Ireland and treated the Irish people in an absolutely disgusting way. And that continued. And all the points in Irish history have been a conflict of the desires of the Irish people for their own nation and their own identity against British oppression. The Great Hunger, the famine as it's called, in the mid-19th century, in reality was a contrived food shortage by the British, which resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of Irish people.
So that was a deliberate,
a
deliberate genocide.
Absolutely deliberate, yes. It was a genocide against the Irish people. Ireland was exporting food at the same time as people were starving. And that was a British decision. And there are many, many others. And so I've always been interested in Ireland and Irish history. And my constituency has a very substantial Irish community, mostly from the south, some from the north, but mainly from the south. And I've always supported the right of the Irish people to their self-determination and got very involved in the miscarriage of justice cases, particularly the Birmingham 6 and Guildford 4, which ultimately they were exonerated and they were released from prison. They'd served nearly 20 years in prison, all of them for things they had not done. And so that whole history is there, and I thought the most important thing was actually direct contact with the representatives of the Irish people, including Sinn Féin. And during the 1980s, together with Ken Livingstone and others, we built up regular contacts with Sinn Féin. We were condemned by our own party leadership for so doing, condemned by many people for so doing, and we were proved to be right. In the end, even Margaret Thatcher recognised that there had to be some kind of political settlement in Ireland. Militarily, it wasn't going to be possible. And eventually this became the Good Friday Agreement after the 1997 election.
Do you think that's enough for Irish republicanism and the freedom and the rights of the Irish people? Do you think that agreement was enough, or do you think there's still more to be done?
It was a very important staging post, because for the first time there was an agreement between the Unionists and the Republican, or the massive Unionists and massive Republicans, that they had to recognise a shared history. They had to recognise conflicts that both communities had been involved in, and this has resulted in the government of Northern Ireland. Now, ultimately, I think Ireland has to be united. And I think Ireland will be united. In fact, it's already happening. In reality, health policy, transport policy, environment policy, so many things are jointly determined between the North and the South. And at some point, I'm sure there will be a fundamental change. There's always been a strange political relationship with Ireland. From the Easter Rising in 1916, there was the most brutal oppression, and Roger Casement, who was one of the leaders of the Easter Rising, was condemned to death and executed in Pentonville Prison in my borough of Islington. Connie Markovits, the first woman ever elected to the British Parliament, was elected for Sinn Féin whilst in prison in my constituency. She was also involved in the Easter Rising. I think the dialogue with Sinn Féin in the 80s was an important turning point in bringing about what is difficult at times, but is a relatively peaceful situation. I was over in Belfast for the Belfast Festival in August, and it was very interesting just talking to people there about the growth of the Irish language, the growth of the Irish national feeling and national identity, and that's something that is unstoppable.
Do you think there was a lot of similarity between your experiences in Ireland with Palestine?
Many similarities, and indeed the interesting thing is the similarities of the struggle for identity of the Irish people with so many other struggles around the world. My partner comes from Mexico, and it's very interesting that in Mexico the Irish people are revered because of the San Patricio Brigade, which changed sides in the war between the United States and Mexico, changed the Mexican side and fought for the Mexicans. The Palestinian people, so wronged by history, so wronged at the end of the Ottoman Empire in 1918, that should have been the point where national identity asserted itself all over the Middle East. Instead, the awful influence of the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement was that the Middle East would be divided up between Britain and France. Britain then also signed the Balfour Declaration, which bizarrely offered a homeland to Jewish people at the same time as continuation for the Palestinian people. The two things were mutually impossible. And eventually, the State of Israel was founded, and the Palestinian people were driven out of that part of Palestine into exile. And I've visited the refugee camps in many countries. I've been in Palestine on many occasions. I've met many Palestinian groups. First went there. I'd been obviously involved in solidarity work with the Palestinians, and I've been many times since then, both in Gaza and the West Bank, and I've also been in Syria and Lebanon and a number of the Gulf states, and of course in Egypt, where everywhere you go there's a Palestinian diaspora. We have, Britain, a responsibility for the plight of the Palestinian people.
Do you think public opinion has really changed, shifted over the past few decades since you first campaigned for Palestine?
Yes, it's no question it's changed a great deal.
And what's due to that success?
Well, post-war, there was a obvious guilt about the treatment of Jewish people. And whilst a number of Jewish people did manage to flee Nazi Germany and settle in the United States or here in Britain or in other countries, a lot didn't. And this then married up with a much earlier Zionist demand for the establishment of a Jewish state, which was actually opposed by quite a lot of Jewish people who didn't want a Jewish state. They wanted Jewish identity, and they wanted their right to Jewish identity in London or Moscow or Berlin or anywhere else. And that state was established, and we have had the conflict between the establishment of that state and the expulsion of Palestinian people ever since. So all through the 50s and much of the 60s, I would say Western public opinion was fairly pro-Israeli on the basis that the Jewish people deserved a place of safety. And I can understand that, and I agree all people deserve a place of safety, and obviously that includes Jewish people deserve a place of safety. I think it began to change in the 1960s. After the Six-Day War, some people began to question what this war was really about, and was it really right that the West would put so many arms in the hands of Israel, which would then occupy large parts of Egypt at the time. Then the big turning point was 1982, the massacre at Sabra and Shatila in Lebanon, Beirut. And that was the big change. And I remember that year's Labour Party conference in Britain voted a motion through in solidarity with the Palestinian people. Never happened before. They'd been always very pro-Israeli, the British Labour Party, as indeed most social democratic parties in Western Europe were, and a much better understanding of the situation. And so when, for example, Operation Cast Lead happened, with the use of white phosphorus and other weapons in that war in Gaza, there were 200,000 people demonstrating in London in solidarity with the Palestinian people. Unprecedented. And so I think public opinion has completely changed.
And you, in your work and your activism, what kind of things have you done and successes you've had to highlight the plight of the Palestinian people?
On the Palestinian question, we've raised the question of prisoners, and we've raised the question of the need for an even-handed approach between Gaza and the West Bank. There was clearly an agenda by the West, particularly by the United States, that they would starve Gaza of aid and provide the aid and support to the West Bank and try to isolate the government of Gaza, the Hamas-led government of Gaza. I think that's completely wrong. It's not a question of whether I agree with every dot and comma of Hamas policy or every dot and comma of Fatah policy. I don't. It's not my call. I'm there in solidarity with the Palestinian people and respect their democracy. I was there as an election observer at the presidential election when President Abbas was elected. I was observing the election in Gaza, in Rafah, and I thought two things. One was, how can you possibly hold a free election whilst under occupation? And secondly, how well run it was, and how determined the Palestinian people were to show that theirs was a democracy and they were going to elect, in this case, the president. I was in Gaza earlier this year, and the situation is terrible. There is a chronic environmental disaster happening before our very eyes, with a water shortage, with insufficient land, and at the same time there's a tremendous determination by the people of Gaza. They're going to be self-sufficient as far as they can, certainly in fresh fruit and vegetables, and try to develop the economy. But the Western pressure, by having the border crossing that Israel controls very limited opening times, which means there's a permanent shortage of everything, unless it comes in smuggled in through the tunnels from Egypt.
Just recently, of course, in August of 2013, there was imminent war on Syria, and to many, surprise to many people, the British Parliament voted against any, involvement in a war on Syria. Now, why did you think that was the case?
Britain, public opinion and trust in politicians has been deeply scarred by the experience since September the 11th, 2001. And you have to look at it in the context of that. September the 11th, 2001. The attack on the World Trade Center was monstrous, appalling, as was the attack on Washington. Suddenly, that is translated into the occupation and invasion of Afghanistan and hunting for Osama bin Laden on the assumption that bin Laden was totally behind it. He may well have been. But I'm not quite sure where the logic of invading and occupying Afghanistan comes from that. But nevertheless, public opinion largely went along with Afghanistan war. I didn't. I was one of a very small number of MPs who voted against the invasion of Afghanistan. And we then moved on to George Bush being given unparalleled powers by the US Congress, with one solitary member of the whole Congress, Senate and House together, Barbara Lee, voting against it, to her eternal credit. She's from California. And then we had George Bush and the Axis of Evil speech in January 2002, in which he rather bizarrely claimed that Iraq under Saddam Hussein was about to invade the rest of the world, when there wasn't any evidence of that. I'm no supporter of Saddam Hussein. Indeed, I strongly opposed him over Halabja and the treatment of Kurdish people, but that's not the same thing as going to war. And then we had the massive demonstrations against the war and the invasion of Iraq, and the cynicism in politicians grew from that. We then had a huge death toll. We've also had very strict restrictions on liberty through terrorism laws and homeland security in the United States, terrorism laws in Britain and other European countries, and a big loss of life by the standards of the modern world of Western armies, much bigger loss of life amongst Afghan and Iraqi people. And so there was a kind of background there. And the Labour Party particularly politically suffered very badly from Iraq, particularly in the 2005 and 2010 elections. And so when the idea that the West should arm the Syrian opposition came up earlier this year, there was a big debate about that, because I'm not here to defend President Assad or his government, but it wasn't clear which opposition they were proposing to arm or for what intention, because there is an Islamicist opposition, there is, if you like, a more liberal opposition, and there is the regime of President Assad. A lot of us were concerned about this, and there was a cross-party grouping that was strongly opposed to arming, and we carried a non-binding backbench motion through Parliament in July opposed to the arming of the Syrian opposition. The government should have noticed that and recognised that. So when David Cameron recalled Parliament at the end of August to try and get approval for it, Parliament voted against it. Now, the Labour Party, I think all Labour MPs that voted against the intervention, and a considerable number of Conservatives for different motives, some to do with the experience of Afghanistan and Iraq, and some saying, well, look, if we go in there, what is actually going to happen? If we start bombing in Syria, just suppose a Russian missile takes down an American plane, or the other way around. Where does that lead to? You've suddenly got the United States and Russia on opposite sides of a hot war. The implications are obviously enormous. And so the Parliament voted narrowly to oppose it, and David Cameron accepted that decision straight away. I thought he would come back and try and get another vote, which he might have succeeded in getting through, not sure. Probably not, but you never know. But that then became a catalyst for lots of other things. United States Congress never voted on it, and instead we had talks between Russia and the United States. We had Syria unwillingly brought into signing the Chemical Weapons Convention, and now the dismantling of the chemical weapons. We also had development of better relations with Iran following the election of President Rouhani, and we also have a Syria conference coming up in January. Now, we're not there yet. 100,000 and more people have died in Syria, 2 million are in internal or external exile. It is a disastrous situation, but I do not believe it would have been any better if the West intervened. I think it would be much worse if the West intervened.
You as an MP and also an activist, and your own experiences, what would you like to tell us, something important that you'd like to share?
The mighty eventually tumble. I first went to Chile in 1969 as a young man, hitchhiking around Latin America, and I joined the May Day March in Santiago in that year, summer 1969, when the Popular Unity movement was growing, and fought the 1970 election, and Salvador Allende was elected president of Chile. He did his best to try to close the ghastly gap between the rich and the poor and try to bring about a better society. The coup took place in 1973. Pinochet came to power, and thousands disappeared and thousands died, and there's still unmarked graves to be found in Chile. And he once memorably said, "Not a blade of grass moves in Chile without my approval." And then, after the big change in Chile in 1990, I was there for that. It was called the Cambio de Mano, change of hand. There was then the development of a human rights movement. And then I remember he came to London on an arms buying mission, And to his credit, Balthazar Garzón managed to get an extradition warrant approved from Spain, and he was arrested in London. Pinochet arrested in London in a hospital by a British policeman. It was an astonishing moment, and we then mounted a huge campaign to ensure that he had to face justice. And eventually, quite disgracefully, he was allowed to go back to Chile on spurious medical grounds. And I was very angry about this. He'd been 500 days under house arrest in Britain. I then went to Chile at the invitation of the committee that disappeared. And I was very angry about it all. But we had a Human Rights Day rally at the Villa Grimaldi, which was the torture centre in Santiago, and I stood there with Michelle Bachelet, who's now the President of Chile, and we both spoke to the crowd there about the need for solidarity around the world and how the mighty tumble. And because of the solidarity of the people of Chile in bringing about that change, in getting rid of Pinochet, and his ultimate arrest, he was diminished and demeaned, and a form of democracy has returned to Chile. How the mighty tumble. Solidarity actions, they always seem hopeless at the time, absolutely hopeless at the time, but eventually it happens. I remember addressing meetings of 6 people in small towns in Britain on the cause of the Birmingham 6 and the Guildford 4, and eventually thousands of people were outside the Old Bailey when they were finally released and declared innocent. So things do change, things can be achieved. Locally, I love my constituency, I love my community, and if I can just finish with this, the thing I'm most proud of is, this is the most urbanised part of Britain, most densely populated place, smallest urban constituency in the country. At the end of this road there was old railway lines that were sidings, and the Thatcher government wanted to change them into being a retail distribution centre with lorries going in and out and all this sort of thing. And we said no, we want a park for our children. And so the children planted trees on this old railway line. And eventually, after years of campaigning, we won it. Gillespie Park is there as a park, and it's a testament to the solidarity of people to improve their lives rather than letting market forces run it for them, and I'm very proud of that.
Jeremy, thank you very much for joining us.
You're most welcome, thank you.